Okay, let me just make sure that the stream is going, and then we will go ahead and get started. Oh, looks like we are going. So yeah, I'll go ahead and then we'll get started in just a few seconds. Okay, so today's sermon is by George Buchanan. We're still reading out Journal Discourses, Volume 19. We're on page 230. The discourse is entitled An Important Conference: The Death of Joseph and the Death of Brigham, the Keys of the Apostleship. Revelation for the guidance of the church comes through the head as to the first presidency. Discourse by Elder George Buchanan, delivered in the New Tabernacle, Salt Lake City, Sunday morning, October 8th, 1877. Reported by George F. Gibbs. Our conference is a most important one that doubtless will be long remembered by those who have participated in its deliberations and actions. It is not often that we as a people have been called upon to pass through such circumstances as those which have surrounded us for the past 4 or 5 weeks. Twice in our history during the past 47 and a half years have we been called to mourn the loss of him who has led the cause of the holy priesthood upon the earth. At both times, the blow has fallen, it may be said, unexpectedly upon us. It was particularly so at the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph, for he had passed through so many difficulties and had so many narrow escapes and so many deliverances from perils of the most menacing character that the Latter-day Saints had been led to regard him as almost invulnerable, and that his life would be spared to a good old age, if not to the winding up scene. His martyrdom, then, fell as a very unexpected blow upon the people. It was a dreadful shock, for when a great bulk of the Latter-day Saints, for which a great bulk of the Latter-day Saints were unprepared. It is true that many were warned, especially those who were abroad among the nations preaching. They had dreams and manifestations of the Spirit concerning the terrible calamity. But those at home were scarcely prepared. Evidences came so quickly, one after another, that there was scarcely an idea among the people that his arrest or his delivering himself up as he did would terminate in such a catastrophe. The church itself was so unprepared by any previous experience for the steps that were necessary to carry on the work that the Lord had established, and of which he had been the instrument. I well remember the feelings that were experienced upon that occasion. How men's minds wander, and the surmises that were indulged in, the guesses, the anticipations, some thinking one man would be chosen and others that someone else would be. Many of the people were at an entire loss to know who would take charge of the church affairs. And while they were not satisfied with Sidney Rigdon, nor his preaching, nor his propositions, a great many were undecided in their minds as to who would be the leader, or who would have the right to stand at the head. When the 12 returned, their voices were heard in the midst of the people. When President Young stood before the congregation and spake to the people, doubt and uncertainty and every kindred feeling vanished, and everyone who had a sufficient portion of the Spirit of the Lord recognized in him the man whom the Lord had chosen to lead and guide his people instead of the martyred prophet. For the first time in the history of the church, the 12 apostles stepped forward and took the charge of affairs by the authority of the apostleship and the authority which they had received from the prophet Joseph. And for a little rising of 3 years, they led and guided the church until the Lord inspired his servant Brigham to organize a first presidency of the church. This experience has been most valuable to us under our present circumstances. Men have looked back to the past. They have remembered what was done at the period to which I refer, and doubtless uncertainty and hesitation have not existed to any extent. In fact, have not existed at all in the minds of those of long experience in the church. The 12 apostles have the authority to lead and guide, to manage and direct the affairs of the church, being the quorum standing next to the first presidency. Naturally, it falls to them to step forward once more and assume the direction and control, to dictate and counsel, and to regulate, so far as may be necessary, everything connected with the organization of the people and the proclamation of the gospel among the nations of the earth. Although the blow has been a heavy one and has fallen unexpectedly upon us, it seemed to me during the past summer, and watching President Young and listening to him and associating with him, they obtained a new lease of life. He had not been able to speak for years in public assemblies with the ease to himself that he had done since the last winter. It seemed that he had overcome his weakness, a weakness of the stomach from which he suffered when he spoke to large congregations. His bodily health appeared to be as perfect as it could be for a man of his age. This being the case, it was a very unexpected thing for him to pass off so suddenly. But in looking back at the circumstances that surrounded him and that surrounded the church and the labors that were so essential for him to perform, we can now understand why it was that he was so greatly strengthened, that he had such vigor not only in speaking, but in performing the labors of traveling and visiting the various settlements that he enjoyed. I do not believe myself that President Young could have felt as happy as I know he does feel had he left the church in the condition it was in when he commenced his labors last spring. Let's see. I am convinced that it has added greatly to his satisfaction. It has been a fitting consummation to the labors of his long life that he should be spared to organize the church throughout these valleys in the manner in which it is now organized. It was remarked by Brother Pratt in his discourse that at no time since the first organization of the church have the Latter-day Saints been so well organized, everything set in order so completely as we now see them. This is his experience and his testimony, and if you know, and you know, he has been familiar with the church from nearly the first of its organization to the present time. I believe this would be the testimony of every man of years belonging to the church. I am thankful this day that President Young was spared to accomplish this work, that the Lord gave him the bodily vigor and the mental capacity sufficient to enable him to close up the labors of his earthly career in so fitting manner. He has marked out the path for the 12 to pursue. And I was a number of times impressed during the summer that the spirit he possessed in relation to these matters impelled him to hurry them up and have everything attended to quickly. Almost a feeling of restlessness was manifest by him, which was so contrary to his usual calmness of manner, to have the work of organization completed. I've been reminded a number of times of the same spirit that rested upon the prophet Joseph. He seemed he could not rest. He was constantly stirring up and urging the 12 to step forward, assume the responsibility that lay upon them, and to impart to the people the knowledge that the Lord had given to him, and to bestow upon the servants of God the keys and authority of the holy priesthood in its fullness. And President Young manifested the same spirit. He lived to receive Elder Taylor and the brethren of the 12 who accompanied him after the return from the organizing the last of the stakes of Zion, and to confer with them. A few hours afterwards, he took his exit. At no time probably in the history of the church have the saints been so calm and so serene, manifesting so little concern in relation to the way matters should go, and the affairs of the church be conducted, as they have on this occasion. It has seemed as though the Lord has prepared the people for these things. He has poured out upon us the spirit of union that has not been enjoyed probably to so great an extent at any time in our history. There are great labors assigned to all of us in every department of the priesthood. If we take up the work and carry it forward in the spirit which has been committed to us by him, now that he is gone from our midst, the Lord will continue to be with us and to bless us as he did him. For he was with him all his life. He was with him in counseling the people. He was with him in prophesying to the people and teaching them and directing them in their temporal as well as their spiritual labors. And the Lord crowned his life with success and his labors with blessings. And they who sustained him and obeyed his counsel have been prospered in every instance. When they received the counsel in a proper spirit and carried it out as it was given to them, they and the church prospered under his presidency and administration. and has gone forth in power and majesty, and in such a way as to bring a conviction to the hearts of thousands of people that there is a power connected with the system called Mormonism, not comprehensible to any who do not view it by the Spirit of God. I feel that we as a people should take hold of this work, that we as apostles, that we as 70s, and as high priests, as elders, as priests, teachers, and deacons should take hold of this work in earnestness and in zeal, and carry it forward as our prophet and file leader did during his lifetime, that we should take it up where he laid it down and carry it on until the end is reached and the full consummation of all things is accomplished, seeking to have the spirit that animated him and to follow him as he followed Joseph, as he honored Joseph, as he revered Joseph, as he upheld Joseph, as he maintained Joseph, touching doctrine and counsel, so that it appears to me that if we are animated by the Spirit of God, we will honor him and follow in his footsteps as he followed Joseph and as Joseph followed Christ. When we do this and take hold of this work with the earnestness and zeal which should characterize our actions, the Spirit and power of God will rest upon us, and he will bear us off as he has borne them off who preceded us. He will not desert us nor leave us in a position where we will be destitute of help. I listened with a great deal of pleasure to that portion of Brother Pratt's discourse which I heard in relation to the apostleship and the authority of the apostleship and the right of the priesthood to rule and to govern. There have been a great many ideas afloat in the midst of men concerning this work, and I suppose that I have been interrogated, I might say, thousands of times. At any rate, I have been interrogated upon this point more than any other, namely, who will succeed President Young in case he dies? Latter-day Saints who had experienced this matter, have not had occasion to ask this question, but many inexperienced saints have it in their hearts, wondering what shape affairs would take in case anything were to happen to the president of the church. Every man who is ordained to the fullness of apostleship has the power and the authority to lead and guide the people of God whenever he is called upon to it, and the responsibility rests upon him. But there's a difference, as explained by Brother Pratt, that arises in some instances from seniority in age, in other instances from seniority in ordination. And while it is the right of all the 12 apostles to receive revelation, and for each one to be a prophet, to be a seer, to be a revelator, and hold the keys in the fullness, it is only the right of one man at the time to exercise that power in relation to the whole people, and to give revelation, counsel, and direct the affairs of the church, of course, always acting in conjunction with his fellow servants. And while we say that the 12 apostles have the right to govern, that the 12 have the authority, that the 12 apostles are the men who preside, when we say this, we do not mean that every one of the 12 is going to give revelations to this great people, and that every one of the 12 has the right to counsel and dictate and regulate the affairs of the church as emergencies may arise, independent of the rest. The church is not governed like Zion's Cooperative Institute by a board of directors. This is not God's design. It is governed by men who hold the keys of the apostleship, who have the right and authority. Any one of them, should an emergency rise, can act as president of the church with all the powers, with all the authority, and with all the keys, and with every endowment necessary to obtain revelation from God and to lead and guide this people in the path that leads to the celestial glory. But there's only one man at a time who can hold the keys, who can dictate, who can guide, and who can give revelation to the church. The rest must acquiesce to it in his actions. The rest must be governed by his counsels. The rest must receive his doctrines. It was so with Joseph. Others held the apostleship. Oliver received the apostleship at the same time that Joseph did, but Joseph held the keys, although Oliver held precisely the same authority. There was only one who could exercise it in its fullness and power among the people. So also at Joseph's death, there was only one man who could exercise the authority and hold those keys, and that man was President Brigham Young, the president of the Quorum of the 12, whom God had singled out, who by extraordinary providence had been brought to the front, although many were ahead of him according to ordination at one time or another. And now that he is gone, only one man only can hold this power and authority to which I refer, and that man is he who you sustained yesterday as president of the Quorum of the 12, as one of the 12 apostles and of the presidency, John Taylor by name. When revelation comes to this people, it is he who has the right to give it. When counsel comes to this people, as a people, it is he who has the right to impart it. And while the 12 are associated with him, one in power, one in authority, they must respect him as their president. They must look to him as the man through whom the voice of God will come to them and to this entire people. By extraordinary providence, he has been brought to the front. Men have wondered at it, why it was so. It is easy of explanation. There was a time when three apostles who now live, whose names were placed above his in the Quorum of the 12. But when this matter was reflected upon, President Young was moved upon to place him ahead of one and afterwards ahead of two others until, by the unanimous voice of the apostles, he was acknowledged the senior apostle, holding the oldest ordination without interruption of any man among the apostles. Not that he sought it, not that he endeavored to obtain it, not that he begged for his place, for it is due to him to say to this congregation today that no man has been more modest in urging his claim or setting forth his right than he. But President Young was led by the Spirit of God, as we do verily believe, to place him in his right position. And 2 years ago, last June, in St. Pete, he declared in a public congregation that John Taylor stood next to him, and that when he was absent, it was his right to preside over the council. We little thought then, at the time, that there would be a necessity so soon arise when he would be required to exercise that power, that authority, and right. Most of the people could very readily imagine that President Young would have outlived President Taylor, but the Lord has ordered otherwise. In relation to ordination, a great many people have imagined that it was necessary to ordain a man to succeed another, and that would impart a special particular efficacy or endow him with some additional power. Ordination is always good and acceptable. Blessings and setting apart are always desirable to those who have to go forth to prepare them for God's service, but it's not necessary that an apostle should be ordained to stand at the head of the people. When the exigency arises, he has already got the fullness of authority and the power of it. I was told of a dream that person had shortly after the death of the prophet. Person dreamed that a certain man had been set apart by the president. The keys had been given to him. And that President Young came and said that he had given to this person, certain person the keys. Now, that of itself, to a person understanding the principle, would carry its own contradiction with it. The man dreamed of was already an apostle, holding and exercising the keys of the apostleship, and therefore it would not have been necessary for President Young to confer again upon him the keys. If every man of the 12 but one were slain, the one remaining would have the right to organize the first presidency of the church, to choose 12 apostles, and to organize the church in its fullness and power, and to preside over it. And his acts would be acceptable to the Lord and binding upon the people. This is the authority of the apostleship. If every apostle anciently had been slain but John the Revelator, as they all were, and there had been faith and men enough left, he would have had the right to ordain other apostles and set in order the entire church and carry forward the work as the Lord should dictate it. So in our day, as I stated, it is not necessary for a man who has received this power and these keys to be ordained and set apart to act. He can act in any position. President Young, when he chose Brother George A. Smith to be his first counselor in the place of Heber C. Kimball, did not lay his hands upon his head to confer upon him any additional power or authority for that position, because Brother George A. held the apostleship in its fullness. By virtue of the priesthood, he could act in that or in any other position in the church. He chose other assistant counselors. He did not set them apart, and there was no necessity for it, as they already held the apostleship. And if he had, he could have only blessed them. He could not bestow upon them any more than they already held, because they had all that he himself had. That is when he chose them from the same quorum. He did not choose several of his assistant counselors. He did choose several of his assistant counselors from the quorum of the 12. He did not put his hands upon them to set them apart, nor to give them the authority and power to act as his counselors. They already held it. It is well for the Latter-day Saints to understand the principles of the holy priesthood and the power thereof, that they may know that it may be known to you, that it may be known by you where the authority rests, who had the right to teach and guide and counsel in the affairs of the kingdom of God. The Lord has revealed in plainness, so that a wayfaring man, though a fool, need not err therein. Was it necessary that Elder Taylor should be set apart to preside over this people? Was it necessary that the 12 apostles should be set apart to preside over this people? No, it was not, for they already possessed the power, authority, and ordination. Was it necessary for the prophet Joseph Smith to set apart Brigham or Heber or Willard or any of the rest of the apostles? No, for the same reason they'd received the fullness of the holy priesthood, the full endowment and the keys, and the authority and the fullness of the apostleship. Therefore, it was not necessary. It might have been done if there would have been no wrong in doing it. There would be no impropriety in blessing a man. There would have been no impropriety in a man like Joseph or Brigham, favored of God with the power to move heavens and bring down blessings upon the children of men. I say there would be no impropriety in such men laying their hands upon any man and blessing him. The Lord would bless him if he were thus blessed. But I'm now speaking of the authority and power of the holy priesthood. The blessing of such men, or by such men, would not bestow upon him any additional authority or any more keys, presuming they already had received the fullness of the apostleship. Some may feel that the Lord should raise up a man by special manifestations of power to preside over his church. They have an expectation of that kind. Whenever the Lord does it, it will be because of there being a necessity for it. Whenever there's a necessity for it, it will not be made plain through one of the 12 set aside from the present. It will not be made plain. It will not be made plain through a 70. It will not be made plain through a high priest or an elder through a patriarch. It will come as all revelations of the Lord come to be binding upon this people through the voice of him whom the Lord chooses to be his voice, sanctioned by the 12 apostles. Hear it, O Israel, and remember it. Have I the right to say who shall preside over this people? No, although an apostle holding the keys with my brethren and being side by side with them, having equal authority with them. Why? Because I am not chosen by the Lord to be his mouthpiece to Latter-day Saints. What I mean by this, to give them revelations. It is not my right. It is my right to instruct and teach the laboring council, but it's not my right to organize the first presidency of this church. Neither is it the right of any other man excepting him whom the Lord has chosen as the president of the 12, with the quorum standing as the first presidency. A day or two ago, a man came here and notified the president of the 12 that he was to be the successor to Brigham. The most charitable construction you can put upon such speeches is that the man is crazy. Whenever the voice of the Lord comes upon a subject, it will come with the power and demonstration of the Holy Ghost with much assurance, and every Latter-day Saint of the earth on the earth will receive it, because the Spirit of God will bear testimony to our spirits that it is from him, so that we can't be deceived. It is our privilege to so live that we will know the voice of the true shepherd and can't be deceived by those who profess to have revelations and have authority when they have it not. And every man and woman in the church should so live that when they hear the true voice, they will know it as they would know the voice of their nearest friend and not be deceived or led astray. Well, but says one, why cannot you organize the first presidency now if the 12 have this authority? You want to know the reason, brothers and sisters, why we do not take this step? I suspect you would like to know why a man and his two counselors are not singled out, called, and set apart by the voice of the people at this conference as the first presidency of the church. The reason is simply this: the Lord has not revealed it to us. He has not commanded us to do it, and until he does require this at our hands, we shall not do it. For the present, it seems to be the mind and will of God is manifested to us that the 12 should preside over the church, and until he does reveal unto his servants as right and proper that first presidency should be organized again, we shall wait. We shall do nothing of that kind. When the voice of God comes again, when it shall be the counsel of our heavenly Father, that first presidency shall be again organized. The quorum of the 12 will be organized in its fullness as before. Therefore, you can wait as well as we for the voice of the Lord, and when it does come, whenever it will be, you will see the church take action in this matter. But until then, the Latter-day Saints, you will be governed by the authority that already exists. If 3 men have the right to govern, certainly 12 men, all possessing the same keys, have that right and that authority. But let us wait the good pleasure of the Lord and cease surmising and cease indulging in vain and foolish ideas upon these subjects. I pray God to bless you and pour out his Spirit upon us all. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Well, this was a good one.
Yeah, I like this. This is a great historical look at a key, juncture in church history, particularly in leadership.
Yeah, a lot of things stood out to me in this one. One thing that stood out to me is debunking the idea of self-perpetuating offices. I don't know if you've heard us talk about that at all.
Yeah, and particularly with like this relates to, certain branches that feel like they have independent authority to just go off and do what they want. But, is that kind of the vein of what you're talking about?
Well, that's another subject. That's good. And that's definitely something else that there's great stuff on presidency and keys in here. But right here, he very directly says that so what I'm talking about is there's an idea that, and this comes from Lauren Woolley, that the keys needed to be passed down for certain presiding positions, like that the and then this was fully expressed by the Joel Lebaronites as self-perpetuating offices. The idea that you have to confer only one person has this authority on the earth at a time, and they have to explicitly ordain their successor for their successor to
Oh,
have that authority. And so Lord Woolley had this idea and had elaborate ideas about how keys were passed from, like, Hiram was in Carthage, but he passed them secretly to Uncle John Smith so that he could have the patriarchal keys, and then Uncle John was able to give them to Hiram's son, and so on. And this idea of the keys needing to be passed on, and like Joseph gave Brigham, he had given the keys to Hiram and to Brigham, and so Hiram died, but Brigham still had them, and so Brigham was, kind of this idea of like this very uh
suggesting that Brigham would have had to have secretly passed them on to John Taylor,
yes,
right?
yes. And with Woolley, it goes, he says, after John Taylor, the presiding keys of the priesthood go to John Woolley secretly, and then John Woolley to Lauren Woolley, etc. And that's kind of how Lauren claimed the succession. But
Right.
he talked about the keys of the presidency separately, where he talked about the keys to the presidency of the church, and that those still were passed down from John Taylor to Wilford Woodruff to Lorenzo Snow to Joseph F. Smith. But then at Joseph F. Smith, he didn't pass it to Heber J. Grant. And so there was a break in the keys, going to Heber J. Grant in Lauren Woolley's model. And so this was not really emphasized a ton in Lauren Woolley's by Woolleyites, because there was a question about who Lauren Woolley ordained to be his successor. And so some people who were big on this idea that the keys need to be explicitly passed to an appointed successor felt that Lauren Woolley's Lamanite prophet idea of being told, that saying that he was teleported to the Yucatan, was the best claim of appointed successor that he gave the keys to. Especially because Leslie Broadbent, who was the presiding apostle after Lauren Woolley, kind of, and Joseph Musser and John Y. Barlow made comments saying that they didn't know where, like, the presiding authority was in the 1930s of fundamentalism. They didn't know where the one man office went, basically. And
Right.
so, and so that's why there were independent Woolleyites who emphasized this Lamanite prophet idea. And so, but anyhow, I like this. And it also goes against like James Strang, who is big on that idea. I mean, obviously, this wouldn't be compelling evidence to a Strangite, um, but it is compelling to it really. This idea, like I said, wasn't very consequential in Wooleyism, but it was in Joel LeBaron's uh, take on priesthood, where Joel taught this very direct self-perpetuating office idea of the presiding office of right of the firstborn, and also the second highest office of the presiding patriarch. He saw these as two self-perpetuating offices independent of the church, and the Joelites did not believe in priesthood separate from the church, above the church, besides those two offices. They very explicitly denied the fundamentalist interpretation that there were many men that held the keys above the church based off of the trial of Sidney Rigdon. And
Meaning
so,
they only thought that the apostles had that they were the exclusive holders of the priesthood authority necessary to lead the church.
well, they believed in the apostles had authority to lead the church, but Joelites believed that there were two offices higher than the apostleship: the presiding patriarch as the second grand head of priesthood, and the um and the right of the firstborn as the first grand head of the priesthood, like the one man office. And so
Okay.
Joelites in their theology say that this one man office was actually not held at all by Brigham Young or John Taylor. They believe that it was secretly, Benjamin F. Johnson was secretly appointed it by Joseph Smith. And then Johnson gave this one man office to Dare, and then Dare gave it to Joel on his deathbed, was their claim
Okay.
to this
I think that's
office.
where I got confused earlier. I thought, yeah, I was doing AI research, and that's what AI suggested because yeah, that must be where that came from. I understand that a little better now.
Yeah, and so, that's Ross and I would argue Dare did not hold that belief of Ben Jeff Johnson secretly presiding over Brigham Young. That was not Ross argued against that in the 1950s, him and Bob Eby, against that interpretation of liberanism. Um, but
Well, I think
Joelites tried
Brigham
to
Young
put,
would have been the character of a man who probably would have said something about it if that had been the case. Maybe,
well,
not
they're like
necessarily, but
the Joelites argument is, well, it was secret. It was secret that Johnson held this higher
right,
office above Brigham
fair
Young.
enough.
Is their kind of argument, and you know that and it's hard to argue from an absence of evidence, right? When they're saying that there shouldn't be any evidence for this because it was secret, right?
Right.
Um,
And I
but
will
then
throw something out because it isn't secret, but I would expect there to be other supporting factors outside the secrecy that kind of point to it, kind of like plural marriage in Nauvoo. Like that was secret, but then you also see a lot of side effects that aren't secret that
you
clearly
would have
point to
some
that
evidence,
being
right,
the case.
of
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Benjamin Johnson secretly being the one man, and Ross's
yeah.
position is different. I mean, and I'd argue this was Dare's position. In his October 1950 letter to Musser, Ross said before his death, Johnson presided over over the priesthood and kingdom. And so that's implying it wasn't after the death of Joseph Smith. It was saying like way later, right? That Johnson held
Yeah.
that presiding position in Ross's view. Um, and so, and Dare's claim, as recalled by Ross, as recalled by Esther, as recalled by John Y. Barlow as an antagonist, is that Dare just claimed that Johnson was one of the men that he was the last man or one of the last men that Joseph had given the keys of the kingdom to, and that Johnson felt, the Lord directed him to pass on the authority that he had given and appoint the birthright of Joseph Smith to Alma Dare LeBaron. That's
Apologies,
the
but did you mention someone named Esther in that list of
Esther.
people?
Yeah, Esther is Ross's sister, who did a
Oh,
lot of LeBaron history, and she had a manuscript of a book about Dare that never was actually published. Um, but I mean, most of it, I think a lot of it was incorporated. Some of it was incorporated in the LeBaron storybook. Some of it was incorporated in a later book by Esther called The Third Man, which is a book about Dare. Some of it wasn't, and I'd say the stuff that wasn't, that was left out and never used, was that she compiled a bunch of stuff that supported Ross's interpretation of priesthood and their family's authority. And so that stuff that supported Ross was left out. But fortunately, that manuscript, I've used it. Chris has used it. It's been a good source for uh, better understanding. As a second witness to Ross, like for example, she records in her history uh, that she read a letter that Ross wrote to some man in the North about his views on priesthood, and she thought it was so erroneously wrong that she took it to her father Dare to read it, to kind of poke fun at it and to show him what Ross was teaching. And she reads the letter snickeringly, she says, and she was kind of wondering why her dad didn't laugh at the letter also. And she said after she read this whole letter, that Dare just turned to her and said with a decisive voice, yet was almost a whisper, "Well, every word of it is true." And bowed his head and didn't say anything else after that. Um,
no
and so
need
that
to say
showed
anything else after that.
so that showed that Ross's views were not a departure from Dare's views, if that makes sense.
Yeah, do we know what the subject was of that content that she was somewhat amused at?
Well, one of the things she didn't like, that she thought was ridiculous, was um, let's see, one of the two, there were two comments. She says, "I don't have that letter still, but I remember two distinct statements. One of them was that I believe Ross said, I I believe or I know that my father holds the same authority on earth that Abraham held, and that I know that my father is the uh is the patriarch to all the world. Those are the two things that she remembered. So she
Oh,
remembered
okay.
two things about the dad's authority being mentioned in that letter. Um, but then she said, "There's another letter I did save that showed his views about that time, and it was a letter by Ross to Musser in October of 1950, which is really good because it's a letter by Ross while Dare is still alive that lays out Ross's priesthood claim, saying that this spring my father gave me a patriarchal blessing and conferred upon me." Um, and conferred upon me all the keys, rights, power, and authority of the patriarchal order of priesthood, and told me to set my family in order. So, it's kind of a tangent to the lesson, but this is good. Kind of
Yeah, so I was going to
fundamentalist.
apologize. I really appreciate you willing to dive off on a tangent like this.
Let's see. I'm just trying to look to see if I have. Uh, let's see. I have that Ross Musser. Yeah, let's see if I have the letter right here too, because the letter, both of them are good. So let's see. Yeah, at a religious gathering in St. George. So this is from Esther's, unpublished history. A religious gathering in St. George, Utah, July 1950. I heard Wesley, that's what they all called him. They called him by his middle name. I heard Wesley give a lecture on patriarchal priesthood, his ideas concerning it, which sounded rather convincing. His personality, handsome appearance, and manner of delivery made my bosom swell with pride that he was my brother. I had no knowledge with which to refute his claims. There was much truth in what he taught, so I listened attentively to all his words. Nevertheless, some of his teaching seemed so wrong. I secretly copied a letter he wrote to some man in the North. I thought to myself, I will show this letter to my father so he can see what a ridiculous bunch of nonsense Wesley is peddling. I remember clearly only two sentences that letter contained. I know my father is the head patriarch of the whole earth, and I know that my father holds the same place that Abraham held when he was on earth. These things seemed so false to me that I jeeringly read the letter to my father Dare when he came for a visit, one of the last times I ever saw him. We were seated alone in Berlin's pickup truck. My father's head bowed over the steering wheel. He listened carefully without saying a word while I read the letter. I poked fun at his snickering mood as I read it and wondered why he didn't laugh at it also. When I finished, my father gave me a stern, piercing look of rebuke that cut me to the center. He spoke in a decisive voice that was almost a whisper. Well, every word of it is true, then bowed his head and said no more. I recall that pretty well from memory. And so then she said that she copied another letter by Ross. Um, let's see if I might not have the full letter online because yeah, I don't think I've ever posted that full letter online. I think it was something that Chris used in his some of his stuff on Dare that yeah, it's kind of weird. That was a very important letter. So, Musser Ross letter, October 1950. It's pretty good. Um, let's see if I have it right here. Let's see. And now it's in my uh oh, okay, there we go. So this is the letter. It's not a long letter, it's pretty short. Um, okay, after he bowed his head and said no more, the spirit present caused me to feel that my father spoke the truth, but I couldn't understand it. My father lived the patriarchal law of marriage, and he was sent to a foreign country to raise his family. And these things he was like Abraham of old to my mind, and there I left the matter. I copied another letter written by Wesley in order to have a record on what he was teaching at that time. So, St. George, Utah, October 20th, 1950, a letter by Ross LeBaron to Joseph W. Musser. Dear Brother Musser, in regard to the patriarchal order and the commission left by my father by Benjamin F. Johnson, I would like to make a brief statement also concerning my own position in the matter. Benjamin F. Johnson joined the church in 1833 at the age of 15. He was birthright in John the Beloved's posterity when was Joseph's closest mortal friend, and lived longer after the prophet than any other of his associates. He was left in charge of the Nauvoo house and Joseph Smith's family affairs. He also had charge while Joseph was yet alive in Joseph's absence. So that's referencing he had the authority to sign, he had legal power of attorney to act as Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. He was one of the youngest members of the Council of the Kingdom and was 25 years of age at the time Joseph Smith gave the last charge to the 12 apostles and records it more clearly than any other I've read. He makes it plain that the 12 received it, the high priesthood, in connection with the Council of the Kingdom. Benjamin F. Johnson died November 15th, 1905. Prior to his death, he presided over the priesthood and kingdom. When my father, Almadair LeBaron, was 9 years of age, Benjamin F. Johnson conferred upon him the patriarchal birthright of Israel. When my father was 19 years of age, Benjamin F. Johnson, shortly before his death, called my father in, gave him instructions, and told him, when I die, my mantle will fall upon you as the mantle of Elijah fell on Elisha. All these matters are in the writings of Benjamin F. Johnson and my father's records, but the Lord showed them to me before I understood them from either my father or Benjamin F. Johnson's writings. This vision or dream took place on the night that I was taken from the courtroom to jail on the conspiracy charge, i.e., conspiracy to live plural marriage. He was convicted of that. He said, I got out of jail 7 days later on my 30th birthday. Last spring, my father gave me a patriarchal blessing, conferred upon me all the keys, rights, and authority of the patriarchal order of priesthood, and told me to teach my family and get them in order. In May, he came out again and gave me the commission to teach and establish the patriarchal order. The patriarchal priesthood presides over the church and kingdom and patriarchal order, being subject only to the higher order of the priesthood after the order of Moses. All patriarchs of the church are subject to the main order. The patriarchal order was established by Jacob. He claiming a blessing above his progenitors. After the return of the 10 tribes, the order can be fully set up. The order consists of 12 birthrights and the 12 tribes mentioned in Revelation chapter 7. Dan will be left out, for he is a tempter in Jacob's family. Ephraim will preside under Joseph and Manasseh under Jacob, making 12 tribes. The birthright of Ephraim will preside over the 12 head patriarchs. And the head of each tribe will sit in the birthright of that house with 11 helpers, making 144 heads. Under each of these, there will be 1,000, making 144,000. When one of these 144,000 dies, his heir will take his place. Joseph Smith held the keys of the patriarchal order and set Hiram over the church, but not over himself. See D&C 124:56 through 60. If the council care to shed any more light on the subject, I would greatly appreciate. If there's any error in what I say, I'll be pleased to change my views, as truth is what I want ahead of any personal ambition. Yours for the word of God, R. Ross W. LeBaron. So short letter, just kind of, it's early. What's great about it is it's when Dare's still alive. And so it shows, that, because she's wanting to document what Ross was teaching at the time and which shows she, in the context of her saying that Dare agreed with what she read to him of Ross's teachings. So
Very cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
yeah, so kind of a tangent, but when it comes to priesthood and succession, this is again there's a lot of apostleship in here. And what Fred points out in his writings is that there's nothing in Joseph Smith's teachings to indicate that the apostleships should technically be the ones to preside over the church, that they presided in the mission field, but they were not to preside in organized stakes of Zion. And so very explicitly in 1835, when the apostleship was called, Joseph directly said that their authority was in the mission field and not in Zion. And then he reiterated that in Nauvoo in May of 1843 during the trial of Benjamin Winchester. Joseph Smith directly said, that their jurisdiction is in all the world but here, is what he said, showing that they did not have jurisdiction in Nauvoo. And so, it was by necessity that the 12 had to step forward and lead. Um, and there was not an emphasis on that on apostleship as being the highest priesthood in Joseph's lifetime. You'll not find a single statement to make that case. I think there's one there's one statement in Nauvoo that people can try to interpret that way, but it's stretching it way beyond what that statement in context was saying. And I showed that in my paper, The Exaltation of the Apostleship, that Brigham Young was very direct in saying that the apostleship's authority was in the mission field and not over organized stakes of Zion. So that is another important aspect, that shows that the doctrine did not change. He said that to Parley P. Pratt in 1848, and he also said it again in 1877. And so the doctrine on where the apostleship's authority lies. And so the reason the apostleship led the church is because they were true to Joseph's teachings and they had to step forward and lead the church is the true circumstance. And Brigham Young at that time says, and now we begin to see the necessity of the apostleship, is what he said on in August of 1844. And so kind of he doesn't mention the transfiguration here, but the people knowing that the Spirit of the Lord recognized in Brigham the man whom the Lord had chosen to lead and guide the people instead of the martyred prophet. But in Utah, what happens when you see apostleship, apostleship, and apostleship, they stopped talking about the temple authority generally and explicitly as being the highest authority. They stopped making those kinds of statements in early Utah, but they started emphasizing apostleship. I believe it was because they were not wanting they hid the true doctrine because of schismatic claims. And I do think the apostleship doctrine also rose up out of the kind of indirectly out of people following the apostles. And so they just kind of, it became the rage to say, that this is the priesthood that is the presiding priesthood. Even though we have statements in Nauvoo about the fullness of the priesthood being in the highest office being a king and a priest. So, that priesthood of Moses, Elias, and Elijah being the highest authority. And so that's the context of early Utah, is that they began to talk about that higher authority and just kind of use the term apostleship to reference, the highest authority that they held. And basically, there's a statement by Brigham Young where he said, all the authority is circumscribed, or may I say, incorporated into the apostleship, which there's a couple of statements by Brigham Young to make that case. But this unfortunately led to people thinking that, the apostleship in and of itself, like in 1835, when the apostles were ordained, or in 1829 or 1830, depending on which year you believe the Peter, James, and John restored the apostleship, that the church had all the keys and powers of the priesthood is what that doctrine led to. But then that creates problems, obviously, with, why did Moses, Elias, and Elijah need to restore additional authority if they already had all the authority in the apostleship? And why did Joseph talk about needing to give the apostles all the higher keys and powers of the priesthood shortly before his death in Nauvoo if they already had the highest authority, And so The most direct statement I like to use are the last charge statements where Joseph directly, because some people interpret Moses, Elias, and Elijah and the temple ordinances in Nabu as, oh, it's not really giving them any additional priesthood. It's just kind of giving them like keys of knowledge, like it's revealing to them how to use the authority they already held. But um, they made very explicit statements where they said if Joseph died without conferring this authority on others, that it would be lost from the earth. And so that is strongly implying that it was additional authority. And that's what lots of those, in going through statements in early Utah about, when I started collecting all the statements where they did mention Moses, Elias, and Elijah, because I went over 20 years without really mentioning it, a very rare occasion, uh, but two times in the 1850s by Orson Pratt. But other than that, it's absent from the discourse talking about Moses, Elias, and Elijah until the 1870s. The late 1870s is when they really began to talk about Moses, Elias, and Elijah's authority again. But what was I going to say? I had a train of thought there. When you put all the pieces together, the apostleship doctrine, it was an innovation that showed up to kind of help unite the saints under the apostles as the ones that were true to Joseph's measures and carrying out Joseph's teachings to kind of create union. But then it later, uh, you could say it was later a stumbling block in that it probably in many ways contributed to the higher knowledge eventually being lost to the saints. So, and whether the saints deserved that or not, you can debate. I do think that Brigham kept alluding to the higher principles and higher priesthood organizations. And I think the other apostles tried to as well, as far as the people were able to receive them. But it is a shame when it's kind of puts a ceiling and a stumbling block upon people. And it led to Lauren Woolley trying to create a doctrine on the priesthood based on the apostleship, where Lauren Woolley invents this idea of there being a higher apostleship than the apostleship of the Quorum of the 12, is idea of the high priest apostleship being this higher apostleship that that they secretly held, that was actually above the apostleship that Heber J. Grant held. Um, and so, it kind of creates a big jumbled up mess. But you see, this sermon is kind of in some ways contributes to that in talking about the fullness of the apostleship. And some people might not know what they're referring to there about fullness of the apostleship. There's a statement by Heber C. Kimball in Wilford Woodruff's journal, in my opinion, that defines it very clearly, as he says, elders have a portion of the apostleship. 70s have a greater portion of the apostleship, but only the 12 have the fullness of the apostleship. So kind of defining, there's the definition of what fullness of the apostleship is, according to Heber C. Kimball. But when George Buchanan's talking about this, he talks a bit about, the temple keys. He makes, I don't know if you noticed, Edward, the kind of veiled references to the temple in in some of his comments.
No, I missed those. If you have time, would you mind pointing them out?
Yeah, so look up the word endowment. So he says, any one of them, should emergency arise, can act as the president of the church with all the powers, with all the authority, with all the keys, and with every endowment necessary to obtain revelation from God, and to lead and guide those people in the path that leads to celestial glory. And then he also, he said Brigham Young, and John Taylor, they'd received the fullness of the holy priesthood, the full endowment and the keys. So very clear equation there. The fullness of the holy priesthood being the full endowment and the keys and the authority. and the fullness of the apostleship. So equating the fullness of the holy priesthood with the endowment, which, as I mentioned, there's statements in Nauvoo very explicitly saying fullness of the priesthood is kings and priests, right? So I noticed I was we kind of went off on some tangents there, but there's a few other things I kind of noticed in talking about, in this. He also talked about, very clear, as you mentioned, one man doctrine statements in there. Um, let's see, I noticed some last charge statements kind of in here. Um, trying to see if I can see. Just look up the word keys, I guess. Um, So I've been reminded a number of times the same spirit rested upon the prophet Joseph. He seemed he could not rest. He was constantly stirred up and urging the 12 to step forward and assume the responsibility that laid upon him, and to impart to the people the knowledge that the Lord had given him, and to bestow upon the servants of God the keys and the authority of the holy priesthood in its fullness. So, holy priesthood, its fullness of the priesthood. There's another reference there to fullness of the priesthood. Um, and that's in the connection of the last charge. Um, he was talking about this in connection to Joseph shortly before his death, had a restlessness to have the work of organization completed, and that Brigham had that same spirit. Um, let's see, there's some other good references. Hold the keys in the fullness. Yeah, he says the right of one man at a time to exercise that power in relation to the whole people, to give revelation, counsel, and direct the affairs of the church. All, of course, always acting in conjunction with his fellow servants. And while we say the 12 apostles have the right to govern and the 12 have that authority, the 12 apostles are the men who preside. When we say this, we do not mean that every one of the 12 is going to give revelations to this great people. Every one of the 12 has the right to counsel and dictate and regulate the affairs of the church as emergencies may arise, independent of the rest. It's any one of them can emergency arise, act as the president of the church with all the powers, with all the authority, with all the keys. But the rest, but there is only one man at a time who can hold the keys, who can dictate, who can guide, who can give revelation to the church. The rest must acquiesce in his action. The rest must be governed by his counsels. The rest must receive his doctrines. So there was only one man who could exercise that authority and hold those keys. That man was President Young, president of the Quorum of the 12, whom God had singled out, who an extraordinary providence had brought to the front. Now that he's gone, only one man only can hold the power and authority to which I refer, and he is whom you sustained yesterday, President John Taylor by name. When revelation comes to the people, it is he who has the right to give it. When counsel comes to this people, as a people, it is he who has the right to impart it. While the 12 are associated with him, one in power, one in authority, they must respect him as their president. They must look to him as a man through whom the voice of God will come to them and to this entire people. By extraordinary providence, he has been brought to the front. So very clear statements on the one man doctrine there. Oh, here we go. And I really like this. This also supports it. He says, all revelation from the Lord to be binding upon this people must come through the voice of him whom the Lord chooses to be his voice, sanctioned by the 12 apostles. Hear it, O Israel, and remember it. Have I the right to say who shall preside over this people? No, although an apostle, holding the keys with my brethren and being side by side with them, having equal authority with them. Why? Because I'm not chosen by the Lord to be his mouthpiece to Latter-day Saints. So what I mean by this, to give them revelation. It is my right to instruct and teach the laboring council. It is not my right to organize the first presidency for the church. Neither is the right of any other man excepting him whom the Lord has chosen as the president of the 12, with the quorum standing as the first presidency. And I also kind of liked the reference. He said we could organize a first presidency now, but we don't feel like we've received revelation to do it yet. So we're not going to do it until we feel like we have revelation to do that. And so I thought that was another good, interesting comment there. Yeah. Anything else stand out to you in this, or any other questions relating to that?
Just a minor thing that it just made me recognize, like, I reading Saints, I was familiar with the transition from, Joseph to Brigham Young was not immediate, like a year or so back, and that there was actually quite a long period where there was no first presidency, so I kind of knew that, going in. But then I also knew, like, a few years later, I found out, like, oh yeah, there was also an interim between Brigham Young and John Taylor, and then the interims kind of got shorter and shorter. So reading this just gives me a new appreciation that it wasn't always how the LDS Church does it today, where one prophet passes away and they, try to call the next one as soon as possible. And because of that, I always assumed that, oh, we'll just pick the guy who has the most seniority on the 12 by ordination. I always just assumed, I guess, that was some later thing that they invented to, like, to pick a new leader without contention. But the fact that, George Buchanan is basically kind of referencing that, at least not saying that, like, that's who, that's not how they pick the first presidency, but he does say that he who has the most seniority, either by age or ordination, does lead, does, give me a better understanding that there is more than them just deciding it arbitrarily to do it nowadays. So that it is based in tradition. And I think that if members of the LDS Church understood today the reasons why Brigham and John Taylor weren't, like, itching to, or the apostles weren't itching to set up a new prophet, because sometimes I hear the sentiment of people be like, oh no, we don't have a prophet. Oh, I hope they call one quick. Oh my gosh, we're profitless. What are we going to do? We're a church without a prophet. If they just read the Doctrine and Covenants, they'll have a better appreciation that the 12 stand in almost the exact same authority, if not the same authority, as the first presidency does, if there is no first presidency, and they might, find a little peace and calm in their minds if they understood these things a little more particularly. So that was just something notable that I reflected on while listening to this.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I told. Yeah. There's a lot of good. And I think we mentioned the senior apostle. You know. I think it's interesting you mentioned he's kind of alluding to Brigham changing the order of the apostles. And, they felt impressed to place John Taylor ahead of several other apostles. Um, kind of, I don't know if you noticed that comment
Well, let me see.
on page 234. There was a time when three apostles who now live, whose names are placed above him, John Taylor in the quorum of the 12. But when this matter was reflected upon, President Young was moved upon to place him ahead of one, afterwards ahead of two others, until by the unanimous voice of the apostles he was acknowledged the senior apostle, holding the oldest ordination without interruption of any man among the apostles.
Oh, fascinating. So John Taylor wouldn't have been the most senior apostle implicitly by seniority or ordination, but he was by a sustaining vote of the 12. Is that what I'm understanding?
So there were issues. So the first thing he mentioned, the first one I think Brigham ruled on was that the the sorry, I gotta deal with the kid real quick. Sorry.
Take your time. Take your time.
So the context is with this statement. The first one I'm aware of is that Orson Pratt, because of his reordination, um, because um he had almost apostatized, right? Oh, sorry, I've got to still deal with this.
No, totally good.
Never mind, it's dealt with. Okay. So Orson Pratt, because of his almost apostasy, over his wife's accusing Joseph of making of trying to proposition her, right? Um in Nauvoo, Orson Pratt was dropped from the Quorum of the 12 during that small period of apostasy that he had, um, where he was not sure who to believe, his wife or Joseph. And, he was kind of aloof for a bit over that issue. And so they dropped him from the Quorum of the 12 and they put, um, oh, what's his name? Amasa Lyman was ordained an apostle in his stead. So that's how Amasa Lyman got ordained an apostle. But then Joseph took Amasa. So when Orson Pratt repented, they basically said, we're going to give him back his position in the Quorum of the 12. And they gave him back his position. And Joseph's like, I'll take Amasa Lyman to be a member of the presidency, is what Joseph's solution was for that. So, but Brigham basically ruled that because Orson Pratt had gone through that period of apostasy, that his date of seniority shouldn't be his original calling in 1835, but his reordination in the 1840s, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does make sense. So was he the
I'm
only
not
one in position above John Taylor then, I guess?
I'm not sure about the other two that he mentioned.
Now, and
Afterwards,
is John
ahead of
Taylor explicitly mentioned in this text, or is it just alluded to?
in what text?
Right here, the text you have highlighted or around it. They don't mention John Taylor explicitly, or am I blind?
Well, he's saying it in connection to he's talking about John Taylor. If you look ahead,
Right.
he's talking about John Taylor as the one who presides,
Okay, great.
and
It is in context. Got it.
that is in the context. And so
Perfect.
I'm curious to the I know one other apostle, Orson Hyde, had his seniority changed. I'm trying to think of who the other apostle was. So I'm going to actually, um, besides Orson Pratt, what two other apostles were dropped from seniority by Brigham Young for John Taylor to become the senior apostle in the LDS Church, and for what reasons? So I'm actually curious about the other because I know Orson Hyde is one, but I'm curious who the other one is that was re-ranked in seniority. Um,
Right.
but Brigham basically said that because of Orson Hyde's and Orson Pratt's teaching false doctrine to the saints, that both of them were disqualified from ever being the presiding priesthood authority to the church.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so that's what Brigham said about Orson Pratt, kind of more solidly solidifying it. Um, okay, that says Woodruff's was moved below Taylor. Um,
Interesting.
okay, okay, so they both so basically it was ranking them based off of um Wilford Woodruff was the other one who was changed. Oh, and the other thing with Orson Hyde was because Orson Hyde also went through a period of apostasy, a brief period in 1839 to 1840. Um, he was suspended on May 4th, 1839, restored on June 27th, 1839. So he was like, it was basically less than 2 months that Orson Hyde had apostatized. siding with Thomas B. Marsh when Marsh turned against Joseph. Um,
Right.
and so Brigham said that, you know, even though Orson Hyde wasn't reordained, he said that because he kind of uh, he left the quorum and had to be returned to the quorum. That should be his kind of new date in the quorum in seniority, which moved Hyde behind Taylor and Woodruff. Um, that brief disfellowshipment he received, even though he was not ever actually uh, out of the church, if that makes sense. So then the other one that was changed was Wilford Woodruff, moved below Taylor because Taylor had actually been ordained first. This was not discipline and did not involve, any problematic behavior on Woodruff's part. But because Taylor and Woodruff were both named to the 12 in the July 1838 revelation, but Taylor was ordained December 19th, 1838, whereas Woodruff was ordained April 26, 1839. So Woodruff was ordained, 4 months, 5 months later. But because
Interesting.
Woodruff was older, he had for years been listed ahead of Taylor.
Oh yeah,
Um,
because I see a note here that says originally the seniority, I guess by Joseph, was chosen by age, which makes sense because they were all like called in the same batch. But then, so yeah, that would make sense if Brigham's reorganizing by ordination date, and getting it sustained, that it's by when they are ordained. So yeah, John Taylor Wood went out in that situation. Interesting. Very cool.
and so the October 186, um, yeah, in 1875, Brigham ruled that, Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde's interrupted service, placed them below Taylor in the ranking of seniority of the apostleships. With Woodruff, it was in 1861. Taylor had read Woodruff's name ahead of his own. Brigham intervened and ordered Taylor placed above Woodruff, explained that Taylor had been ordained 4 or 5 months before Elder Woodruff. Young reportedly said he wanted to settle the matter because the time would come when a dispute might arise about it. Thus, Woodruff's displacement occurred around 14 years before the Pratt and Hyde adjustment. So that's what Brigham is referencing. So the first adjustment was uh, referencing Woodruff, then the other two were Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. So
This is a completely irrelevant question, so feel free to skip it. But I don't live in the Utah area. Do you know any like people who have the name Orson as either their first or middle name? Because I can't think of any. I
ooh,
know plenty
that's
of like Brighams and all the
that
other
name
ones.
kind of apparently fell out of disuse.
Yeah, yeah, it did.
But,
Yeah.
maybe it's like a subconscious cultural memory that Orson was problematic.
Yeah,
Uh,
like we like Orson, but I'm not naming my son after him. That's just kind of I was just wondering that. It popped in my brain. I'm like, oh yeah, I don't really know any Orsons.
and so then I like just to kind of end one last comment that I really liked here is that John Taylor was humble about his claim. He said, not that he sought for it, not that he endeavored to obtain it, not that he begged for his place, for it is due to him to say this congregation but today that no man has been more modest in urging his claim or saying forth his right than he. Um, but President Young was led by the Spirit of God, as we do verily believe, to place him in the right position. And 2 years ago, last June, in St. Pete, he declared at a public congregation that John Taylor stood next to him. And when he's absent, it was his right to preside over the council of the apostles. So, so I like that about John Taylor being humble in his claim, just as Brigham we know was humble in his claim. That seems to be a good leader. It's this problem of aspiring men who seek to magnify themselves and seek to, I mean, not magnify themselves as in like in a good way of magnify the responsibility they're doing, but seeking a bad person is seeking to magnify like aggrandize their authority over others rather than to, seeking, responsibility to fulfill that responsibility, right? There's a very big difference.
Now, this might, to me, comes across as almost, if I'm remembering correctly, this might be a bit of a satisfying character arc for John Taylor, because unless I'm remembering incorrectly, after Joseph taught about like the law of adoption, I seem to recall that there was one of the more prominent brethren that sent people around town actively campaigning and trying to scoop up, as many people as possible as would be sealed to him as sons. Was that John Taylor or someone else?
Brigham said both John D. Lee and John Taylor engaged in that behavior.
Okay.
So,
So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a beautiful character arc if, he goes from this position of seeking out, glory and honor by like actively campaigning for, sons in the priesthood to this point where he's very, humble and meek about it. I think that's kind of a beautiful historical perspective on his character.
yeah, and it could be that Brigham misunderstood their seeking for sons, kind of thing. Like, John D. Lee kind of the way he described his practice of adoption was in a more modest way, I think. But maybe John D. Lee was bad.
Okay.
Maybe Brigham was accurate in his criticism of John D. Lee and John Taylor and how they practiced adoption. But yeah, I agree. I think that these guys, even if they did kind of have, I mean, there were problems with John Taylor in 1847. He and Parley P. Pratt, as I talked about a bit, were problematic for some of the things they did in 1847, both with unauthorized sealings of plural wives through each other, and also in um, changing the organization of the second company coming to Utah, disregarding Brigham Young's uh, directives on how he wanted the second company to be organized. And so, yeah, there were some struggles, but Brigham Young felt that John Taylor at that time was more of a younger apostle. He felt more the blame fell on Parley than on John Taylor, if that makes sense.
Well, and that just highlights Brigham's character that he's, not gonna, let it drive a wedge between him and John Taylor. Good for
Yep.
him. Great men. I love these brethren.
So yeah, this is great. This is another one on priesthood that I think is valuable. I think it was Charles C. Rich we read a while back that talked about keys and presidency in, a few sermons ago. That was really good in laying out that principle. And George Q. Cannon lays it out again that, you may have keys, but there's still presidency that's directing and the authority that's organizing and leading how things should be. So yeah, we're gonna be taking a break for the weekend. Tomorrow's Friday, and we're not doing readings on Friday anymore. But when we resume on Monday, we've got a sermon by John Taylor, Gospel revealed for the benefit of the world, witness of the Spirit, priesthood, high priests and 70s, energetic missionaries, duties of presidents, bishops, elders, priests, deacons, teachers, and deacons, relief societies, tithing, the Perpetual Immigration Fund, common schools.
Good timing
So,
for that one.
yeah, looking forward to this one. And yeah, this is a good one by George Q. Cannon. And we'll just keep on keeping on. So, well, cool. Thanks to everyone else who's tuned in and hope to see everyone who's able to on the next one.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye.